In the small, isolated town of Bracken Ridge, there stood an old, forgotten manor at the edge of the dense woods. The locals called it the Hollow House, not just because it had been abandoned for decades, but because of the eerie, hollow echoes that seemed to seep from its walls at night. No one dared venture too close, for fear of the tales that had been whispered down through generations. Stories of strange voices, shadowy figures, and the chilling disappearance of anyone who dared enter. It was mid-October, the season of dwindling days and long, creeping nights, when a young couple, Cla and David, arrived in Bracken Ridge. They were newcomers, city dwellers looking for a fresh start in the quiet countryside. Cla, an artist, was enchanted by the decaying beauty of the Hollow House. Its crumbling facade and overgrown garden seemed like the perfect inspiration for her work. David, a writer, was less enthusiastic, but indulged his wife's fascination. "Just a few sketches," Cla promised as they stood before the rusted iron gate, which hung open as if waiting for them. David hesitated, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. But Cla was already pushing the gate wider, her eyes alight with curiosity. The inside of the house was even more decrepit than they had imagined. Dust-covered furniture sat untouched, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet as they ventured deeper into the manor. Yet, there was something about the place that drew Cla in. She set up her easel in what had once been the grand parlor, the faded remnants of luxury barely visible through the grime. As Cla began sketching, David explored the house. He wandered through darkened hallways and peered into rooms that seemed frozen in time, untouched since the last occupants had vanished. The deeper he went, the more he felt a growing unease, as if unseen eyes were watching him. Suddenly, he heard a soft whisper, so faint it could have been the wind. But as he strained to listen, the whisper grew louder, more insistent, like someone murmuring just out of sight. David's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the sound to a narrow staircase leading down to the basement. The steps creaked ominously as he descended into the darkness. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with a suffocating presence. David's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the stone walls. And then he saw it, a faint outline of a door hidden in the far corner, almost invisible against the dark stone. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as he approached the door, which seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Against his better judgment, David reached out and turned the rusted handle. The door creaked open to reveal a small, windowless room. In the center of the room was a single ancient chair, its wood darkened with age. But what truly terrified David was what surrounded the chair. Hundreds of scratches etched into the stone walls, as if someone had clawed at them in desperation. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into pitch blackness. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, overlapping and echoing in the confined space. They spoke in an indecipherable language, yet David could feel their anger, their pain, and their hunger. He fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge, trapping him with the unseen entities. Upstairs, Cla continued to sketch, oblivious to her husband's terror. But as her pencil moved across the paper, the lines she drew began to twist and warp on their own. The image of the parlor she was sketching morphed into something nightmarish, dark figures standing in the corners, their hollow eyes watching her with malevolent intent. Cla gasped, dropping her pencil as the whispers reached her too. They were louder now, emanating from the very walls of the house. She stood up, heart racing as the room seemed to close in around her. The shadows in the corners of her drawing began to move, slithering along the walls like living darkness. Panicked, Cla called out for David, but there was no answer. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her mind with their ghastly chorus. She stumbled out of the parlor and into the hallway, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The house seemed alive, the walls pulsating as the whispers enveloped her. Desperate to escape, Cla ran towards the front door, but it too had changed. The once clear path was now obscured by thick shadows, and the door itself seemed miles away. The whispers were inside her head now, relentless and maddening, telling her secrets she could never understand. As she reached the door, A cold hand gripped her wrist. She turned, expecting to see David, but there was nothing, only the empty, darkened hallway. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and Claire felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She screamed, yanking her hand free and bursting out of the house into the safety of daylight. Outside, the whispers stopped, leaving Claire in stunned silence. She turned back to the house, its decaying exterior now seeming even more sinister. David was still inside. She knew she had to go back, but the thought of re-entering that cursed place filled her with dread. The door creaked open as if beckoning her, the darkness within promising to consume anyone who dared return. Claire took a step forward, then stopped. She couldn't do it. She couldn't go back in there. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the truth. David was lost, and the Hollow House had claimed another victim. As she backed away, the whispers began again, faint and mocking. The door slowly closed, sealing whatever horrors lay within. Claire turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty streets, but the whispers followed her, a reminder that some places should never be disturbed, and some doors should never be opened. The small town of Willow Creek was known for its quaint charm, nestled deep in a valley surrounded by thick forests. But among the locals, there was one place they avoided at all costs, a dilapidated, weather-beaten house on the outskirts of town. Children dared each other to approach it, but no one ever ventured inside. The house had a reputation, one steeped in stories of strange happenings and unexplained disappearances. It was said that the house had once belonged to a reclusive woman named Margaret Hastings. She had lived alone, keeping to herself, with only her collection of dolls for company. Margaret was often seen at the local market, buying fabric and trinkets for her dolls, but she rarely spoke to anyone. Then, one day, she simply vanished, leaving her house and her dolls behind. No one ever found out what happened to her, and the house was left to rot, untouched by time. Years later, a young woman named Emily moved to Willow Creek. She was a school teacher, looking for a quiet place to start over after a difficult breakup. When she heard about the old Hastings house, she was intrigued rather than frightened. Emily wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, and the idea of restoring the old house to its former glory appealed to her. She purchased the house at a bargain price and moved in, determined to make it her own. The house was in worse shape than Emily had anticipated. The floorboards creaked, the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and dust coated every surface. But she saw potential beneath the decay. As she began the long process of cleaning and repairing, she discovered Margaret's collection of dolls. They were scattered throughout the house, some sitting on shelves, others propped up in corners, all staring with their glassy, lifeless eyes. One doll in particular caught Emily's attention. It was larger than the others, almost the size of a small child, and dressed in a faded blue dress with lace trim. Emily found it in the attic, tucked away in a dusty old trunk. She decided to keep the doll, thinking it might add a touch of vintage charm to the house once it was cleaned up. As the days passed, strange things began to happen. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes. Doors that Emily knew she had closed were found open. Objects seemed to move on their own, and she would often hear soft footsteps when she was alone in the house. At first, she dismissed it all as her imagination, but the incidents became more frequent and unsettling. One night, as Emily was drifting off to sleep, she heard a faint giggle. It was the sound of a child, distant but unmistakable. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, but the house was silent. Shaking her head, she told herself it was just a dream and tried to go back to sleep. But the giggle came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of small, pattering footsteps. Emily grabbed her flashlight and got out of bed. She followed the sound to the hallway, where she found the doll sitting upright in the middle of the floor. She could have sworn she had left it in the attic, yet here it was, staring up at her with its one good eye. A shiver ran down her spine as she picked up the doll and returned it to the attic, locking the door behind her. The next morning, Emily found the doll in her bedroom, sitting on the chair by the window. She felt a wave of unease wash over her. Something was wrong. She decided to get rid of the doll, convinced that it was the source of the strange occurrences. She wrapped it in an old blanket and took it out to the shed, locking it away where it couldn't disturb her. That night, the giggling returned, louder and more insistent. It echoed through the house, accompanied by the sound of footsteps running up and down the hallway. Emily's fear turned to terror as she realized that the doll was no longer in the shed. It was back in the house, and it was angry. Desperate, Emily grabbed the doll and drove to the edge of the forest, intending to bury it where it could never be found. She dug a deep hole, threw the doll in, and covered it with dirt, hoping that would be the end of it. But as she turned to leave, she heard a voice, cold and menacing, whisper in her ear. "You can't get rid of me that easily." Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She spun around, but there was no one there. The forest was silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. She hurried back to the house, trying to convince herself that it was all in her head, just a bad dream. But when she returned, the doll was waiting for her on the inside the house, looking out the front window. Its cracked face twisted into a sinister grin. Emily screamed, dropping her keys as she backed away. The doll's one good eye seemed to follow her, and she knew without a doubt that it was watching her, waiting. The next few days were a blur of terror and sleepless nights. Emily could feel the doll's presence wherever she went, its malevolent energy seeping into every corner of the house. She began to hear whispers, telling her to do things, dark and violent things. She resisted, but the whispers grew stronger, more insistent, until she could barely think straight. Finally, Emily couldn't take it anymore. She packed her bags and fled the house, leaving everything behind, including the doll. She drove until she reached the next town, checking into a motel where she spent the night in fitful sleep. But when she awoke the next morning, she found the doll sitting in a chair by the door, its face staring at her with that same look. In the end, no one knows what became of Emily. Her car was found abandoned by the side of the road, but she was never seen again. The house in Willow Creek still stands, empty and decaying, with the doll inside, waiting for its next victim. The locals say that if you listen closely at night, you can still hear the giggling of a child and the soft whisper of a voice that never really left. In the bustling city of Ashcroft, where old buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with new constructions, there was a small, unassuming antique shop tucked away in a narrow alley. The shop was run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Waverly, who had a reputation for acquiring the rarest and most unusual items. People came from all over to browse her collection of trinkets, furniture, and curiosities, but there was one item in particular that she kept hidden away. A large, ornate mirror with an intricate gilded frame. Mrs. Waverly never spoke of the mirror, and it wasn't displayed in the shop. It was kept in a back room, covered by a heavy velvet cloth. She had found it years ago in the attic of a crumbling mansion that was being demolished. The moment she laid eyes on it, she knew it was something special, but the mirror's history was shrouded in mystery. All she knew was that the original owner had met a tragic and untimely end. One rainy afternoon, a young woman named Sarah entered the shop. She had recently moved to Ashcroft and was looking for something unique to decorate her new apartment. Sarah had always been drawn to antiques, believing that they carried a certain charm and history that modern items lacked. As she wandered through the shop, her eyes caught sight of a glimmer of gold peeking out from beneath the velvet cloth in the back room. Curiosity piqued, Sarah approached the hidden object. Mrs. Waverly appeared from behind the counter, her expression turning stern. "That's not for sale," she said firmly, but Sarah could see the reluctance in her eyes. "Why not?" Sarah asked, her hand already reaching for the cloth. Mrs. Waverly hesitated before responding. "It's cursed," she finally said, her voice low. "This mirror has a dark past, and I don't want anyone getting hurt because of it." But Sarah was intrigued. She didn't believe in curses, and the idea of owning something so mysterious was too tempting to resist. After much persuasion, and against her better judgment, Mrs. Waverly reluctantly agreed to sell the mirror, warning Sarah to be careful. Sarah left the shop, the mirror wrapped carefully in heavy brown paper to protect it from the rain. She couldn't wait to hang it in her apartment, imagining how it would add a touch of elegance to her living room. Once home, she unwrapped the mirror and marveled at its craftsmanship. The glass was flawless, with no signs of age, and the frame was intricately carved with delicate patterns that seemed to shimmer in the light. She hung the mirror on the wall opposite her bed, admiring how it reflected the room's soft, warm glow. But as she stood there, gazing into the glass, she thought she saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadow that wasn't her own. She blinked, and it was gone. Shaking her head, she chalked it up to exhaustion and went about her evening. That night, as Sarah slept, the air in her apartment grew heavy and cold. The mirror, once just a beautiful piece of glass, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. In the dim light of the room, a figure slowly emerged in the reflection. A woman, her face pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at Sarah as she slept. The figure's mouth moved as if whispering, but no sound came. When Sarah awoke the next morning, she felt an inexplicable sense of unease. The air in her apartment felt different, stale, almost oppressive. She dismissed it as the lingering effects of a bad dream, but as she went about her day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Sarah would catch glimpses of the woman in the mirror, always just out of the corner of her eye. She would see her standing behind her own reflection or moving through the room in ways that didn't match Sarah's movements. At first, Sarah tried to ignore it, but the sightings became more frequent and more disturbing. One evening, as she sat in front of the mirror brushing her hair, Sarah noticed that the woman in the reflection was not mimicking her movements. Instead, she was standing still, staring directly at Sarah. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she realized that the woman's eyes were filled with a deep, unrelenting sadness. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Sarah leaned closer, trying to read the ghostly figure's lips, but before she could make out the words, the reflection shattered into 1,000 pieces. Sarah screamed, stumbling back from the mirror, her heart racing. But when she looked again, the glass was whole, as if nothing had happened. Desperate for answers, Sarah returned to Mrs. Waverly's shop the next day. The elderly woman seemed unsurprised to see her, and without waiting for Sarah to speak, she led her to the back room where the mirror had once been stored. "I warned you," Mrs. Waverly said softly. "That mirror is haunted by the spirit of its previous owner. She was a young woman, much like yourself, who was betrayed by someone she loved. In her grief, she took her own life in front of that mirror, and now her soul is trapped within it." "Is there any way to free her?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Mrs. Waverly sighed. "There's a ritual, but it's dangerous. You must confront her in the mirror and help her find peace. But if you fail, her spirit will take yours, and you'll be the one trapped in the mirror." Despite the risks, Sarah knew she had to try. That night, she lit candles around the mirror and prepared herself for the ritual. As she stood before the glass, the woman's figure appeared again, more solid and real than ever before. The room grew colder, and the flames of the candles flickered wildly. "Please," Sarah whispered, "tell me what you need." The woman in the mirror began to cry, her tears leaving dark streaks on her pale cheeks. She reached out, her hand pressing against the glass as if trying to escape. Sarah mirrored the gesture, her palm against the cold surface. In that moment, she felt a wave of emotion, pain, sorrow, and a deep, aching loneliness. The woman's lips moved again, and this time, Sarah could hear her, a soft, mournful whisper. "Help me." Without thinking, Sarah pressed harder against the mirror, and the glass began to warp and ripple like water. The woman's hand broke through the surface, and suddenly, Sarah was pulled into the mirror, surrounded by darkness. She was standing in a room identical to her own, but the air was thick with despair, and the walls seemed to close in on her. The woman stood before her, her eyes pleading. "He betrayed me," she said, her voice echoing in the darkness. "He promised me love, but he left me to die." Sarah could feel the woman's anguish, and she knew she had to help her find peace. "You don't have to stay here," Sarah said gently. "You can let go." The woman hesitated, her eyes filled with uncertainty. But then she nodded, her form beginning to fade. As she disappeared, the darkness around Sarah lifted, and she found herself standing back in her own apartment, the mirror intact and the candles still burning. The mirror no longer held the woman's reflection, and the air in the apartment felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Sarah knew the spirit was gone, freed from her torment. But as she gazed into the mirror, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within her as well. A piece of the darkness had stayed behind, a reminder of the ghost in the mirror and the pain that could never truly be forgotten. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood, the streets were always deserted by nightfall. It was a peaceful place where everyone knew each other and nothing much ever happened. But that changed one autumn evening when the residents began receiving strange phone calls in the dead of night. It started with Mrs. Carter, an elderly widow who lived alone in a small, tidy house at the end of the cul-de-sac. She was known for her early bedtime and meticulous routine. So when her phone rang at exactly midnight, she was startled. Fumbling in the dark, she answered the call, her voice trembling with sleep. "Hello," she whispered, expecting to hear the voice of a neighbor in distress, or perhaps a wrong number. But there was only silence on the other end. Mrs. Carter repeated her greeting, her unease growing, but the silence persisted. Then, just as she was about to hang up, she heard it. A faint, rasping breath, followed by a voice barely audible. "Help me!" The voice was weak and filled with desperation. Mrs. Carter's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to ask who it was, but the line went dead. Shaken, she convinced herself it was just a prank and tried to go back to sleep, but the voice echoed in her mind, making rest impossible. The next night, at precisely midnight, the phone rang again. Mrs. Carter answered, and once more, there was silence, followed by that same chilling voice. "Help me, please." This time, she was sure it wasn't a prank. The voice sounded so real, so close, like someone was in her house, whispering into the phone from just the other side of the wall. Panic set in, and Mrs. Carter called the police. When they arrived, they found nothing unusual. No signs of a break-in, no footprints, and no indication that anyone had been in the house besides her. They reassured her it was probably just a crossed line or a technical glitch, and left her with a sense of uneasy reassurance. But the calls didn't stop. Night after night, at the stroke of midnight, the phone would ring, and the same plea for help would echo through the receiver. Mrs. Carter wasn't the only one experiencing this. Soon, other residents in Maplewood began receiving the same calls. Each one described the voice as faint, desperate, and haunting. A sense of dread spread through the neighborhood. No one could explain the calls, and no one knew who was making them. The police were baffled, unable to trace the origin of the calls, as they all seemed to come from different numbers, some of which didn't even exist. Then, one night, a young couple, Mark and Lisa, who had just moved into Maplewood, received the call. Unlike the others, they were determined to find out what was happening. Mark stayed up late, waiting for the phone to ring, and when it did, he answered it immediately. "Who is this?" he demanded, but there was only the familiar silence followed by the weak voice. "Help me. I'm trapped." Mark tried to engage the caller, asking where they were and how he could help, but the only response was a soft, pitiful sob, and then the line went dead. Frustrated and scared, Mark decided to do some digging. The next day, he visited the local library and scoured old newspapers and records, hoping to find some clue about the mysterious calls. After hours of searching, he came across an article from nearly 50 years ago, detailing the tragic story of a young woman named Evelyn Turner. Evelyn had lived in Maplewood when it was a new development. She was a vibrant, beautiful woman, engaged to be married. But one night, she disappeared without a trace. Her fiancé searched for her desperately, but she was never found. The last known sighting of Evelyn was the night she disappeared, when a neighbor saw her answering the phone in her home. The article mentioned that the police believe she might have been abducted, but there were no leads, and the case went cold. Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the connection. Could Evelyn's spirit be the one making the calls, reaching out for help that never came? That night, Mark and Lisa prepared themselves for the midnight call. When the phone rang, Mark answered it calmly. "Evelyn, is that you?" There was a long pause, and then the voice responded clearer this time. "Yes." Mark's heart raced. "What happened to you? How can we help you?" The voice hesitated, and then, in a whisper that sent shivers down Mark's spine, it said, He took me, buried me, beneath the floor." Mark and Lisa exchanged horrified glances. They realized that Evelyn was trying to lead them to her final resting place. The problem was, they didn't know where that was. But the phone call continued, the voice now more insistent, repeating, "Beneath the floor, beneath the floor." They decided to investigate their own house first, given that it was one of the oldest in the neighborhood. Armed with flashlights and a crowbar, Mark and Lisa pried up the floorboards in the basement, hoping and dreading what they might find. As they lifted the boards, they uncovered a shallow grave. Inside, wrapped in a tattered blanket, were the remains of a woman. The air in the basement grew heavy, almost suffocating, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Lisa gasped, stepping back in horror as Mark knelt beside the grave, his heart heavy with sorrow. "We found you, Evelyn," Mark whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "You're not alone anymore." Suddenly, the room felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The phone, which they had brought down with them, rang one last time. Mark answered it, his voice trembling. "Evelyn?" There was no voice this time, only a soft sigh of relief, and then the line went dead. The call stopped after that. The residents of Maplewood returned to their normal lives, though the memory of those terrifying nights lingered. Mark and Lisa made sure Evelyn received a proper burial, giving her the peace she had been denied for so many years. But even now, on quiet nights, some say they can still hear the faint ring of a phone in the distance, followed by a whisper, a plea for help that echoes through the darkness, reminding everyone that some spirits never truly rest.